Okay, so I'm delighted to be joined now by Gil Horsky, who is one of the most recognized voices in food tech. With a background that spans both strategic investment and brand building at major food companies, he has a deep understanding of the intersection between consumer needs, technological potential, and market dynamics. Now, as managing partner of Flora VC, he's here to unpack what's really happening in the food tech investment space today, where the opportunities lie, and what lessons investors and founders alike should be carrying forward. Gil, thanks so much for joining Protein Production Technology International.
Thank you, Nick, for having me. Very excited to join you today.
So for those less familiar with Flora VC, could you briefly introduce the fund and what types of ventures you're particularly excited to support?
Sure. So, Flora VC kind of is a genesis of my longstanding career in the food industry that kind of, had the privilege of working for over 16 years for some of the largest food companies such as Nestle, Pepsi, and Mondelez. And when I looked to start Flora, really my vision was, how do we actually tackle and invest in the most pressing issues, both for the consumer, the planet, but actually also for the industry? And a lot of times, the ventures forget that, there's an old food industry here that it has to be disrupted and has very specific needs. So we focus on early stage companies in the pre-seed and seed stages, focusing on ventures coming out of Israel and Europe, and companies that are basically addressing two major pillars. One is what we like to call food and human health, and food and agriculture and planetary health. So on the food and human health, I've been for many years a big believer in the space of food as medicine. I've been speaking about it for a long time, and I'm excited that finally it's catching up and others are speaking about that as well. We just recently backed and actually incubated and backed a very exciting company in the GLP-1 space and the weight management space. It's still stealth, so stay tuned. Soon it's going to come out. So that's one example of weight management, functional benefits, anything blurring the lines between food and actually almost medicine and healthcare, because as we know, food is the biggest impactor on human health. And the number one cause of death at the end is related to food and nutrition. And the second pillar is planetary health, and it's linked to food and agriculture. So as we know, food and agriculture has a huge impact on green gas emissions and methane, on food waste and sustainability. And we're very excited on the topics of investing in regenerative agriculture, sustainable crops. We invested in an amazing company out of Sweden called Olsao that actually developed the wheat variety that is more sustainable for saline water and warm weather. So those are sustainable packaging. So those are some of the cases that I'm very passionate about as an investor.
Well, let's talk about the landscape as it is today. So from where you sit, how would you describe the overall mood in the food tech investment world? Are we cautiously optimistic or still in a bit of a hangover from the past 2 years?
We're for sure not in a hangover. The hangover is done, unfortunately. And I think I actually think we're in a good place, meaning good. It's very tough for everybody. And I'll elaborate in a second why, but for the right reasons. I always like to say, I've been working in the food industry for some years now. And I always like to say I joined the food industry where it was not sexy. Then it became over sexy. And now it became a bit less sexy. But we're here to stay. And the reason why I'm saying that is, and you rightfully said, you talked about the hangover, you used that impression. Until a few years ago, kind of in the whole years between probably 2019 until 22, 23 maybe, probably then was 23, there was a huge hype in food and agriculture tech. A lot of new funds, a lot of money, a lot of generalist investors investing, a lot of amazing entrepreneurs. But the problem was that that segment was treated as other segments. So investors, some generalist investors, and even entrepreneurs were having the expectations that these companies that they're founding or investing in would grow like a digital company or like a fintech company or like a cyber company. But we both know that food and agriculture is complicated. there's capex, there's biotech sometimes, there's regulation, there's clinical trials, depends on the field you are. Or if you're in agriculture, you need to wait every time for the new season to start to test whatever you're doing. So that takes time, requires a lot of money. A lot of time it has in hardware or capex component or manufacturing component. And actually, I think everybody found out it doesn't grow as fast as everybody was hoping, or many new investors was hoping. So I think what's happening now, there's a bit of a wake-up call to understand, yeah, food and agriculture is a huge industry, has a huge impact, probably the biggest impact we spoke before about human health and planetary health. But we need to use a different lens and understand you need patience, you need time, and you need a lot of expertise. And I think what's happening now is those of us that are sticking around and still committed to the space are coming to that with a much more open eyes and understanding those challenges. But as I said, it's a tough time. A lot of companies are struggling to raise, and a lot of segments have been probably went almost washed out. Like, we read on a daily basis, both of us, the same articles of vertical farming companies going to chapter 11. A lot of the alternative protein companies are struggling. So cell base is taking longer than expected. So I think a lot of those, there's a shift also in some of the topics that I think are more interesting to investors than what was before.
Mm. So are you seeing a shift in the types of founders or business models that are getting attention now compared to a few years ago?
Yeah, so I think, until recently, I think a lot of the interest, and there is still some, of course, interest in rightfully. I mean, we also back companies in that space. There was a lot of excitement about kind of deep tech, biotech companies, which I think is still very exciting. But I think what we're also seeing now, obviously, with all the advancements of AI and technological developments, we need to remember, food and agriculture is one of the top 10 biggest industries in the world. Depends on the latest data, but some people claim it's around $8 trillion end to end. But there's a famous McKinsey study done a few years ago about the top 10 industries, and their level of digitization in food and ag scores the lowest. So actually, there's a lot of use cases of pure technologies, meaning AI, big data, IoT, even automation and optimization of processes that are done in other industries that are still needing to kind of basically being so-called copy and pasted into the food and agriculture industry. And that's a space that I think a lot of investors are looking of purely digitizing this industry that is still, the value chain, the supply chain. A lot of these topics have not been still optimized for the 21st century. So some of that is happening now. And I think that's an exciting space. I think, as I said before, the food as medicine space now, especially with GLP-1 and weight management and tremendous pressure on the food industry from the pharma industry, is actually creating a lot of interest of betting on things that actually have true efficacy. It can actually charge a premium that is more similar to healthcare than to food. And another one, which is kind of connected to today's world, is actually all the pressures around trade wars and uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty is really leading rightfully to a lot of entrepreneurs, investors, and ventures looking at the space of supply chain resiliency, procurement resiliency, and how that is optimized. Because today, a lot of those processes are very old-fashioned. And I think that's also a very exciting space to bet on today.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to be looking at some of those geopolitical complexities a bit later on. Looking at that food tech, I don't want to call it a boom and bust, but let's just use that phrase. What do you think were some of the biggest blind spots that investors or startups may have missed?
I think, one was, again, unrealistic expectations and timing. Some things are just unknown. Like I always give the example of a regulatory process. It can take months, it can take years, it can also never happen, never come through. Mm-hmm. So, and I think for investors that didn't come from the space, a lot of time there was a thinking of an equation: more money equals moving faster, which is maybe true in more tech-driven businesses, but actually in businesses like food tech, ag tech that either have a big science component or a regulatory component, actually more money a lot of times doesn't help. A regulatory process doesn't matter if you have 100 billion or $100,000 in the bank, you can't really expedite very much that process. You need to just wait. So a lot of companies and founders and investors were not realistic or not knowledgeable enough about the length of the processes. That's one. Two, I think there was overhype in valuations became very high, and companies were raising too much money. And always when you raise too much money, there's always the problem that you also spend it much. So there was a lot of spending. And I think the last thing is, which is still to be proven, unfortunately, there was a big belief that the large food companies, and those that I come from also, would acquire technologies. So, the tech world, we see, company, I don't know, a Google going and buying, or, um, SAP, or it doesn't matter, Microsoft, just going and buying a team or a very early stage technology because they want to have that capability or block a competitor. And sometimes they can buy them for hundreds of millions or even billions. In food and agriculture, that has hardly happened till today. They mainly buy real businesses, distribution, revenue. Yes, if there is a technology, it's very exciting, but you need to build a company. And I think that notion of I'll bring a super cool technology, I'll do a bit of PR, I'll get a bit of patents, and I'll be acquired has not happened. And I don't think it is going to happen. So I think the mindset should be much more long-term. I need to build a company that gets to the market and commercializes and generates revenue or distribution and some power in the market. And then you can actually be a more or target to corporation or religion or one of those.
Mhm. Now, you mentioned that early food tech hype. Was that inevitable, a kind of necessary growing pain, or could it have been handled more smartly?
I think always in life, everybody looks back and says we could have done things better or differently. I think it's a normal evolution of industries, to be honest. I think although the food and agriculture industry existed for, centuries, the tech component of it is still new. I always like to say that probably, I think the first time I heard the actual term food tech was around 2015, right? So this is like 10 years. So it's still a new sub industry. And I think it's some growing pains. We all, everybody today is very excited about climate tech. Let's not forget that 15 years ago, there was a big boom called clean tech, and it disappeared. So I think it's a natural evolution. And I said for the long term, I think it's a good thing because it's going to actually make people learn a lot of strong lessons learned. It build a much more resilient food and agriculture ecosystem with stronger companies.
Mhm. You've mentioned things like food as medicine. So what else is catching investors' attention these days? Where's that new energy flowing?
Yeah, so food is medicine for sure. As mentioned before, supply chain, a resiliency, a lot related to now people also potentially needing to move away from the concept of globalization to much more local manufacturing and sourcing. I think there's a lot of interest and obviously a lot around going on. And that's where my old world comes from, the cocoa world. There's a more and more understanding of climate change on some key crops and potentially huge industries. Look at what happened to the cocoa prices. Last year, there's this really beautiful chart that shows that cocoa prices actually outpaced Bitcoin price. So, you know, I just read an article a few days ago about coconuts. There've been a topic, a lot of discussion about coffee and vanilla. So I think a lot of the discussion so far has been around how do we create replacements for these using fermentation, cell-based, plant-based. But I think, and that's important, but I think actually there needs to be much more discussion about how do we improve actually the existing agricultural practices in yields of farmers in these spaces. So meaning, how do we actually make cocoa farming much more efficient and profitable for farmers and more supply to meet demand, the same as with coffee and others. And that's a whole different world of, potentially new varieties that are more climate resilient, new agricultural practices, maybe regenerative agriculture, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, the last topic, which we also briefly touch, is the digitizing, basically bringing digital business models into food and agriculture, which is a completely different profile of companies. Those could be AI companies, SaaS companies that can scale much more. They don't need regulatory approvals, no capex, no biotech. And I think the final one um, that I would mention as well is I'm personally a big believer in the need to basically um, simplify a lot of the manufacturing processes and scale ups in the food and bio-based industry. And I think we're seeing some interesting models of initially every biotech or fermentation company was trying to develop their own infrastructure manufacturing. And now you see some more interesting companies developing, actually being a co-manufacturer that you can actually go and you don't need to invest in scale up. They'll be your scale up partner, which makes a lot of sense. I mean, we've seen this like in other industries as well. So those are some of the areas that I think are very exciting.
On the flip side of where the energy is flowing, are there any categories that investors are quietly starting to back away from, even if the founders of those companies haven't yet received the memo?
Yeah. So I think one is unfortunately in the space where, the name of the, part of the name of the organization you represent, I think alternative proteins and plant-based and cell-based, I think have gotten a huge, huge hit. I think there's several reasons. I think there was a lot of money flowing too. I think there's a lot of companies. It's very hard to differentiate today. There's so many companies trying to replace milk or meat, etc. And they're just, for investors, it's almost hard to differentiate between them. And also some of the public companies that there was a lot of excitement about, like the famous example of Beyond Meat. At the end, it's been very disappointing. I just looked recently, I think the price share is like, I don't know, like the company is valued, I think like $200 million today or something like that on the stock market. It used to be several billions before. Mm-hmm. So I think that segment, unfortunately, has taken a big hit. I think it would need to evolve. I think we'll need to have better products there that would meet, the needs of consumers and price point and texture and taste. I think the other one is, some areas in ag tech have been, have been having a harder time. A lot of them have been capex intensive and had the hard time scaling up. And I think that's a space that, either or regulatory perspective that have kind of, and I think in general, once you start talking with farmers, they tell you they're fed up already with another entrepreneur from Silicon Valley or from a tech hub or from an accelerator calling them and trying to sell them. They hardly make a living. They're looking just to break even and make a living. They're not looking to bring some fancy technology inside unless if this technology really delivers an amazing ROI and is ready to go, which is usually not the case. So I think a lot of the ag tech startups also are starting to understand that, selling to farmers and counting on farmers paying a premium is just not going to happen. So I think that's a space that for sure is going through an evolution. The last thing I would say, which is really important, I think, to some of the topics we discussed, the food and agriculture industries are low margin industries. They're about scale and low margin. And historically, most of the companies and founders that work in this space brought new technologies, and usually new technologies are more expensive. And the belief was, and I've seen thousands of decks say this, the consumer, the farmer, they would pay a premium because it's healthier, because it's more efficient. And yeah, they'll pay 2x for this sugar reduction solution or for this new technology in the farm because it's much better than what there is. They won't. The answer is they won't. I know I've been in the food industry for many years. I worked in large food companies. They just won't. They're looking actually at minimum, they're looking for price parity to what they have to change, or actually for a price improvement. So basically earning more. And I think that's something that the food and agriculture startups and founders need to start changing in their mindset of how they deliver that. Because the notion of charging a premium, somebody paying more and having a lower margin for you to have a business is just not going to work in this industry.
Mm-hmm. I guess we're seeing a focus more on things like profitability and fundamentals now compared to that vision and mission pitches a few years back.
Totally right. Exactly. Well said. Yeah.
You talked about the supply chains before and the complexities with, commodities such as cocoa. It seems like we can't go a week without hearing about another commodity price spike. You mentioned coconut as well. What's really driving that behind the scenes?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I also asked myself. It's funny. I worked, for a lot of years in Mondelez and on the cocoa business, which is an amazing industry. And it's interesting because everybody knew that the industry, the supply chain is broken. This is not a new topic. I think there's always a trigger. So specifically in cocoa, there was a lot of things that happened together, is obviously with cocoa, more than 70% comes from two countries in Western Africa, Ivory Coast and Ghana. And the rest spread in a lot of different countries, mainly in, Latin America, Asia, and a bit of other African countries. And what's happening is, for a lot of years, the yields and the infrastructure and the agricultural practices, especially in Western Africa, have been quite old-fashioned, very inefficient. A lot of farmers, young locals, have actually moved to do other things because it's very regulated, the market there, and they actually don't earn as much as they can get in other industries. Even if the price goes up, by the way, because the government basically regulates the price that they sell to the government, and then the government sells it forward. So actually what happened is there's been a big decline of the supply of cocoa. And on top of it, with climate change, the yields have even went down. And on top of it, they obviously had a flu that kind of basically created a huge issue of a lot of dead trees and very, very, very low yields in the last 2 years. So all of these things have created a tremendous pressure on the cocoa industry. And as I mentioned before, the price has skyrocketed. And I think you see similar issues happening in coffee, similar topics happening now in coconut, and it was before vanilla. I think in cocoa, the main thing is just that it's so concentrated in two markets, the supply today, that I say sadly that I think, one of the big, needs of the industry would be to create much more diversification. You are seeing that more and more cocoa farms now building up more modern ones and larger ones in Latin America and countries like Brazil and Ecuador, etc. So those are some of the things. The large players have been investing on those spaces and doing a great job, including Mondelez that I worked with and I still collaborate very closely with, and with their amazing Cocoa Life program, etc. But I still think that the large cocoa industry and players should work more together and truly helping, modernizing the way we grow today cocoa, and bring some best practices, because today it's a very complex crop, but still there's a lot of very huge inefficiencies in the way it's been grown, or in the supply chain, by the way, huge waste in the entire supply chain. So I think those are some of the things that are happening. And again, each crop has its own little story, but I think cocoa, as you rightfully said, is definitely every day, because we all love eating our Cadbury or Milka bar. It depends on where we are. So
We're going to get a little bit up to date now and talk about some recent current events, and there's a lot of them to discuss. The recent implementation of tariffs and ongoing geopolitical tensions, such as the conflicts in the Ukraine and the Middle East, they've disrupted global supply chains significantly. How are those disruptions impacting the sourcing and supply chain strategies of food and food tech companies?
I think a huge impact. So in a way, I feel bad for everybody, like as if they didn't have enough problems. Adding to that, I think the geopolitical topics, of course, we've seen all the Ukraine-Russia war, obviously with Ukraine being such an important supplier of wheat and other crops. That's been going on for several years, and we've seen a lot of hikes in pricing, etc. And, I'm originally, as you know, from Israel, in a lot of the conflict in the Middle East and in Yemen, in some of the biggest sea routes have been kind of either blocked or closed, have created also a huge shortage of some commodities, or things taking much longer, costing much more. So I think all of these things have definitely created a lot of pressure, but adding on top of it, obviously, is the most recent uncertainty with Trump's tariffs. And I think what it really creates is one tremendous pressure on companies, on the large players, to suddenly have much more local manufacturing and sourcing everywhere, because you don't need to move things from country A to country B and have tariffs, which is, by the way, the whole notion of localization is the complete opposite. I mean, it started then what we had in the industrial revolution and globalization in the last 100 years. I would say the only positive, unfortunately, since COVID, a lot of players have been preparing for that more. But still, that creates a lot of pressure, and a lot of players are now starting to create more manufacturing facilities, sourcing facilities, trying to grow different partnerships, et cetera, in different regions of the world, not to depend on tariffs. And for the startups that don't have those resources, because a startup cannot have a manufacturing facility in Europe and one in the US, I think for some of them, it's a tremendous pressure point, because we spoke about before, food and agriculture has low margins. And if you're a food startup and you need to bring ingredients for country A and a machine from country B, and suddenly you need to pay 30% more on them, you just don't have the ability to pay for it. So I think it's creating a humongous turmoil. It's a story that is still being written as we speak, right? So let's see what happens.
Yeah, let's hope it has a happier ending than its superior at the moment.
Hopefully Trump is not going to make too many troubles and be open to negotiate and create some framework that work for everybody.
Yeah. One of his colleagues, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr., he's the USA's Health and Human Services Secretary. He's expressed intentions to overhaul FDA regulations, including eliminating the self-GRAS process. So how much might those regulatory changes affect innovation and product development in the food tech space?
So that's another unknown. I mean, RFK is an interesting character, and he has a lot of different opinions. I think what we know today is a few things. We know there's a big turmoil in the FDA. A lot of people are leaving. So, in the FDA and the regulatory processes were not known to be fast before. So with those human changes and a lot of shortages of resources and, now a lot of cost cutting, by the way, in the US governments, as we know, with Dodge and Elon Musk, etc. So things are just taking longer. That being said, there's also optimism that potentially, he might streamline some of the processes and make them faster, but still, it's also an unknown. And I think that as long as it's unknown, a lot of players are in a bit of a wait and see approach. Now, again, going back, we're talking about innovation and startups. If the end result is going to be much faster, seamless processes and clarity and things that move faster, that's amazing. But at the moment, the uncertainty, I think, is very difficult for investors in startups. Again, startups are, at least they knew what the process is in the past, but now everybody's waiting to see, and usually time means money. So let's see. I am hopeful. The one thing I would say is, again, and I'm not going into politics in this conversation, but the new administration in the US in general is very business oriented, let's say. We can agree or disagree on what they're doing. So my hope is that they'll take steps that, help businesses in the food and agriculture industry. And by the way, a lot of them are lobbying. The large food companies in the US have written letters recently to the government, etc., both on the tariffs and the regulatory processes. So the hope is that at the end they'll take an approach that actually make things better and not worse on their regulatory processes, because it was not really amazing before, to say the least. So
we can only hope. We've just got a few wrap questions now, Gil. For founders navigating the current environment, what's one piece of advice would you offer when it comes to pitching to investors in 2025?
So I think a few things. I think one is know your story, know what differentiates you, because again, investors see so many different startups and presentations. So really think about what is your moat, what is your competitive advantage. Learn about the investor. There's not anything more that investors like or dislike when somebody doesn't know even what they invest in or what they're interested in. So find those commonalities. And And I think the last is, focus on the fundamentals. So in the past, it was all about vision and big story and sell stories, and doesn't matter if they're going to happen or not. Today, showcase, and we spoke about some of the things in the conversation today, show how you quickly become profitable. How do you understand the processes of scale up and regulatory frameworks? Show how you're going to actually deliver more margin or profitability to the retailer, the large food company, or the consumer, or the farmer, instead of actually you're going to charge a premium on them and having them earn less. So I think going back to the basics, being humble, showing how every dollar you get is going to work really hard, then you're going to get tremendous progress with every dollar you spend. I think those are some of the things that investors are really looking at today.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask you to get your crystal ball out now. I mean, 3 to 5 years ago, nobody could have predicted what's happening today. But I'm going to ask you to look ahead 3 to 5 years. What gives you the most optimism about the future of food tech?
Yeah, so I'm very optimistic. I mean, because I'm going back to the fundamentals. Huge industry, $8 trillion. We all eat and drink. An industry that is least digitized. We have huge climate pressures, huge healthcare issues. So I'm very optimistic and for the need. And I think as we kind of started the conversation, I think the current challenges are actually going to make it stronger. Better, stronger startups that are more efficient. The technological developments hopefully can make more progress with less money. So, and I think my biggest hope is that we'll have a few exciting exits and unicorns and public companies that go. And I think a few success stories go a long way. Again, we used to have a few years ago, the big story of alternative proteins and plant-based and Beyond Meat, but that's been a few years ago, and it's not looking as bright as it is. So we need a few kind of case studies that we can all be proud of to showcase, how this future can look like. So,
yeah, well, it's still a very young industry, and there's still many, many, many more years to feed the planet. So, look, Gil, thank you very much for joining us. It's been fascinating talking with you, and hopefully, I'll see you in person one day.
No problem. Yeah, Nick, really enjoyed talking with you, and thanks for this opportunity. And looking forward to chat more.
Great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much.